Thank you, Tracy, and thank you so much for coming. Why is so much writing so bad, and how can we make it better? Why do we have to endure so much legalese, as in the revocation by these regulations of a provision previously revoked subject to savings does not affect the continued operations? Why do we have to suffer through so much academies, as in it is the moment of non-construction, disclosing the absentation of actuality from the concept, in part through its invitation to emphasize in reading the helplessness of its fall into conceptuality? Why is it so hard to set the time on a digital alarm clock? Well, there's no shortage of theories, and the one that I hear most often is captured in this cartoon in which a boss says to a tech writer, "Good start, needs more gibberish." In other words, bad writing is a deliberate choice. Bureaucrats insist on gibberish to evade responsibility. Pasty-faced nerds get their revenge on the jocks who kicked sand in their faces in high school and the girls who turned them down on dates. Pseudo-intellectuals try to bamboozle their readers with highfalutin gobbledygook, trying to conceal the fact that they have nothing to say. Well, I have no doubt that the bamboozlement theory is true for some writers some of the time, but as a general explanation, it doesn't ring true. I know plenty of scientists and scholars who do groundbreaking work on important topics. They have no need to impress and nothing to hide, but still, their writing stinks. The other theory that one often hears is that digital media are ruining the language. Google is making us stupid. The digital age stupefies young Americans and jeopardizes our future, producing the dumbest generation. Twitter is forcing us to write and think in 140 characters. Well, an implication of the dumbest generation theory is that it must have been much better before the digital age, like the 1980s. You remember that era, don't you? Those of you who lived through it, the era in which teenagers spoke in fluent paragraphs. Bureaucrats wrote in plain English. Every academic journal article was a masterpiece in the art of the essay. You remember those days, don't you? Or was it the 70s? The thing is that bad writing has plagued us in every era. In 1961, you had a writer lamenting that recent graduates, including those with university degrees, seem to have no mastery of the language at all. Well, let's go back to 1917, before the era in which radio and television dumbed down the language. Well, then they were saying, from every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate. Every high school is in disrepair because its pupils are so ignorant of the merest rudiments. Well, maybe you have to go back to the golden years of the European Enlightenment, like 1785. In which a commentator wrote, "Our language is degenerating very fast. I begin to fear that it will be impossible to check it." And then there are the ancient grammar police who wrote, "Oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little bird." A better theory comes from Charles Darwin when he wrote, "Man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write." That is, whereas speech is instinctive, writing is and always has been hard. Your readers are unknown, invisible, inscrutable. They exist only in your imagination. They can't react or break in or ask for clarification. And as a result, writing is an act of pretense, and writing is an act of craftsmanship. So what can we do to improve the craft of writing? For many decades, this question had a standard answer. You hand students a copy of this, The Iconic Elements of Style, by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White, who also known as the beloved author of Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little. Note that both of these gentlemen were born before the turn of the century, that is, before the turn of the 20th century. Now, undoubtedly, there is a lot of good sense in the iconic elements of style. Little Gems like use definite, specific, concrete language, write with nouns and verbs, put the emphatic words at the end, and my favorite, their prime directive, omit needless words, which is an excellent example of itself. There's not a needless word in it. On the other hand, for all its good sense, I believe that the elements of style cannot be the basis of writing advice in the 21st century. For one thing, a lot of the advice is obsolete. Here's an example. They write that to finalize is a pompous, ambiguous verb. Now, this is surprising advice in the 21st century when finalize is a perfectly respectable and indeed an indispensable verb, but it was new in the 1930s. It grated on their ears. It came from the world of business and was thereby stigmatized. And so they deemed it pompous just because it was unfamiliar to them, but the language changes. It earned its place because it expresses an essential concept, and now it's hard to see what the fuss was about. Similarly, they write, to contact is vague and self-important. Do not contact people. Get in touch with them, look them up, phone them, find them, or meet them. Well, yeah, but what if you want to text them or email them? Or what if you don't care how one person gets in touch with another, as long as they do so? Well, in those cases, to contact is an extremely handy verb. It just happened to be new in their era, and they did not cultivate an ear for ongoing change. Also, some of the advice is baffling. For example, they advise that the word people is not to be used with words of number in place of persons. That is, you may not say 3 people. Why not? Well, if of 6 people, 5 went away, they explain, how many people would be left? Answer, 1 people. Did you get that? By the same logic, you should never be able to say, I have 3 children or 32 teeth. Or how's this one? Note that the word clever means one thing when applied to people, another when applied to horses. A clever horse is a good-natured one, not an ingenious one. The problem with traditional style advice is that it consists of an arbitrary list of do's and don'ts based on the tastes and peeves of the authors. It's not based on a principled understanding of how language works. As a result, users have no way of understanding and assimilating the advice, and much of the advice is just wrong. I think we can do better today. We can base advice on the science and scholarship of language, on modern grammatical theory, which offers more sophisticated analyses than the old pedagogical grammars that had been ported over from Latin, on evidence-based dictionaries that use corpora of English text, on research from cognitive science on what makes sentences easier or hard to read, and on historical and critical studies of usage, and that's what I have tried to do in the sense of style. It begins with an effective model of prose communication. As I mentioned, writing is an unnatural act. Good style, therefore, must begin with a mental model of the communication scenario, how the writer imagines the reader, and what the writer is trying to accomplish. And my favorite model of effective prose communication comes from a wonderful book by the English scholars Francine-Noël Thomas and Mark Turner called Clear and Simple as the Truth. And they refer to this model as classic style. The model behind classic style is that prose is a window onto the world. That is, the writer has seen something in the world that the reader has not yet noticed. The writer positions the reader so that she can see it with her own eyes. The reader and writer are equals, and the goal is to help the reader see objective reality using conversation as the style. Now, this might seem obvious. What else could the goals of written communication be? But in fact, Thomas and Turner identify a number of styles, of which classic style is just one. For example, they talk about contemplative style, oracular style, practical style. But the one that academics typically write in, they call postmodern or self-conscious style, in which, quote, the writer's chief if unstated concern is to escape being convicted of philosophical naivete about his own enterprise. They explain, when we open a cookbook, we completely put aside and expect the author to put aside the kind of question that leads to the heart of certain philosophical traditions. Is it possible to talk about cooking? Do eggs really exist? Is food something about which knowledge is possible? Can anyone ever tell us anything true about cooking? Classic style similarly puts aside as inappropriate philosophical questions about its enterprise. If it took those questions up, it could never get around to treating its subject, and its purpose is exclusively to treat its subject. Well, it would be hypocritical of me to extol a style of writing that uses examples that anyone can see for themselves without providing an example, and here's one. It comes from an article in Newsweek by the physicist Brian Greene on the theory of inflationary cosmology. And I'll just quote one paragraph. If space is now expanding, then at ever earlier times the universe must have been ever smaller. At some moment in the distant past, everything we now see, the ingredients responsible for every planet, every star, every galaxy, even space itself, must have been compressed to an infinitesimal speck that then swelled outward, evolving into the universe as we know it. The Big Bang Theory was born. Yet scientists were aware that the Big Bang Theory suffered from a significant shortcoming. Of all things, it leaves out the bang. Einstein's equations do a wonderful job of describing how the universe evolved from a split second after the bang, but the equations break down, similar to the error message returned by a calculator when you try to divide 1 by 0, when applied to the extreme environment of the universe's earliest moment. The Big Bang thus provides no insight into what might have powered the bang itself. Now, in this passage, Greene walks us through some fairly sophisticated cosmology and physics, but he does so in a way that anyone can see with their own eyes. So as long as you can imagine space expanding, you can run the mental movie backwards and see why physicists originally proposed that there was a Big Bang from an infinitesimal speck. And also, even the abstruse mathematical concept of equations breaking down, he presents in a way that anyone can appreciate. You can either literally pull out a calculator and divide 1 by 0, and indeed your calculator will return an error message, or you could try to wrap your mind around the concept of dividing the number 1 into 0 parts to see that this would be conceptually problematic. And that kind of providing a reader an ability to see things for herself is the essence of classic style. Now, many examples of writing advice, all those lists of don'ts, turn out, or many of them turn out to be implications behind of the model of communication behind classic prose. For example, in classic prose, the focus is on the thing being shown, not on the activity of studying it. So here is an example, a hypothetical example of an introduction to a paper or review chapter of a kind that I assume many people in the room are all too familiar with. In recent years, an increasing number of researchers have turned their attention to the problem of child language acquisition. In this article, recent theories of this process will be reviewed. Well, no offense, but not that many people are all that interested in how academics spend their time. A more classic way of introducing the same topic would be, all children acquire the ability to speak and understand a language without explicit lessons. How do they accomplish this feat? A corollary is to minimize the kind of apologizing that seems almost mandatory in academic prose. I'll give you another example, the hypothetical, but I trust all too familiar. The problem of language acquisition is extremely complex. It is difficult to give precise definitions of the concept of language and the concept of acquisition and the concept of children. There is much uncertainty about the interpretation of experimental data and a great deal of controversy surrounding the theories. More research needs to be done. Now, this is the kind of paragraph that can be deleted at a stroke with no loss of content. Because classic prose gives the reader credit for knowing that many concepts are hard to define and many controversies are hard to resolve. The reader is there to see what the writer is going to do about it. Another corollary is to minimize the hedging that appears to be mandatory in academic prose. The sprinkling of softener words like somewhat, fairly, rather, nearly, relatively, seemingly, in part, comparatively, predominantly, apparently, so to speak, presumably, as if to imply that the writer doesn't really mean anything that he's actually saying. And Similarly, the use of shutter quotes in which a writer distances himself from a common idiom. I'll give you a couple of examples. This is from a letter of recommendation that I received. She is a quick study and has been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. Well, are we supposed to interpret this as saying that this young woman is a quick study, or as saying that this young woman is a quick study, namely someone who's only rumored or alleged to be a quick study, but really isn't? And if she can educate herself in virtually any area that interests her, does that mean there are some areas that interest her where she's just not bright enough to educate herself? This bad habit was brought home to me when I met a fellow psychologist after a number of years at a conference. I will not mention this distinguished scientist's name. And I asked how she was doing, and she pulled out a photograph of her 4-year-old daughter, and she said, "We virtually adore her." Well, why the compulsive hedging? There is a well-known acronym in bureaucratic circles, abbreviated as CYA, Cover Your Anatomy. But there is an alternative, namely so sue me. That is, in classic prose, it's better to be clear and possibly wrong than muddy and, as the physicists say, not even wrong. Also, classic prose counts on the cooperative nature of ordinary conversation. For those of you in psycholinguistics, on Gricean conversational postulates. So if I were to write Americans, in recent years, Americans have been getting fatter, you don't hold me to the claim that every last one of the 350 million citizens of the country have all been getting fatter. In context, you interpret it charitably as meaning, on average or in general, Americans have been getting fatter. And that is a stratagem that writers of classic prose use to avoid being too pedantic. A second critical feature of classic prose is to keep up the illusion that the reader is seeing a world rather than listening to verbiage. Hence the traditional bit of writing advice, avoid cliches like the plague. We are all familiar with a kind of writer who dispenses prose such as the following. We needed to think outside the box in our search for the Holy Grail, but found that it was neither a magic bullet nor a slam dunk. So we rolled with the punches and let the chips fall where they may while seeing the glass as half full. It's a no-brainer. The problem with writing in cliches is that it either forces the reader to turn off her visual brain and just process the prose as blah, 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 blah. Or if she does think through the language to the underlying images, she'll inevitably be derailed by the ludicrous imagery that comes from mixing metaphors, as in this from another letter of recommendation. Jeff is a Renaissance man drilling down to the core issues and pushing the envelope. It's not clear how you can do all of those at the same time. Or this is from a New York Times article. No one has yet invented a condom that will knock people's socks off. And people who write in this way are also eligible for membership in AWFUL, namely Americans who figuratively use literally. Now, it is perfectly respectable to write, she literally blushed. It is much more problematic to write, she literally exploded. And it is very, very bad to write, as I have once seen, she literally emasculated him. Third, classic prose is about the world. It's not about the conceptual tools with which we understand the world, and so avoids meta-concepts, that is, concepts about concepts, like approach, assumption, concept, condition, context, framework, issue, level, model, paradigm, perspective, process, role, strategy, tendency, variable, and admit it, you use these words a lot in your prose. So here's an example. This is from an op-ed by a legal scholar in the New York Times. I have serious doubts that trying to amend the Constitution would work on an actual level. On the aspirational level, however, a constitutional amendment strategy may be more valuable, which is to say, I doubt that trying to amend the Constitution would actually succeed, but it may be valuable to aspire to it. Or this one, an email from from my own university about a student. It is important to approach this subject from a variety of strategies, including mental health assistance, but also from a law enforcement perspective. Translation: we should consult a psychiatrist about this man, but we may also have to inform the police. Fourth, classic prose narrates ongoing events. We see agents performing actions that affect objects. Non-classic prose thingifies events and then refers to the thing using a dangerous tool of English grammar called nominalization, making something into a noun. So instead of appearing, you make an appearance. Instead of organizing something, you bring about the organization of that thing. The English scholar Helen Sword calls them zombie nouns because they kind of lumber across the scene with no conscious agent actually directing their actions. And they can turn prose into a Night of the Living Dead. Here's an example from the methods section of a psycholinguistics paper. Participants read assertions whose veracity was either affirmed or denied by the subsequent presentation of an assessment word. To wit, the people saw sentences each followed by the word true or false. Subjects were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation, which is a fancy way of saying we tested the students in a quiet room. But it's not just academics who write in zombie prose, it's also politicians. When the Republican National Convention was threatened by a hurricane a few years ago, Governor Rick Scott said, right now there is not any anticipation there will be a cancellation, which, in other words, right now we don't anticipate we will have to cancel it. And just to be nonpartisan, here is a politician from the other major political party, John Kerry, who during the Middle East peace negotiations said, the president is desirous of trying to see how we can make our best efforts in order to find a way to facilitate, which is to say, the president wants to help. And corporate consultants. A journalist interviewed a young man, asked him what his profession was, and he said, I'm a digital and social media strategist. I deliver programs, products, and strategies to our corporate clients across the spectrum of communications functions. When the journalist confessed that he had no idea what that meant, finally he got the man to say, I teach big companies how to use Facebook. And it's also product engineers. Combustion heaters and portable generators used to carry the following warning sticker. Mild exposure to CO can result in accumulated damage over time. Extreme exposure to CO may rapidly be fatal without producing significant warning symptoms. Yeah, whatever. As a result of this wording, every year several hundred Americans asphyxiated themselves and their families by running portable generators indoors, until they finally replaced the warning with this one. Using a generator indoors can kill you in minutes. And so classic style can literally be a matter of life and death. Yes, literally. Part two, how can an understanding of the design of language lead to better writing advice? Well, another notorious contributor to zombie prose is the passive voice. The difference between the dog bit the man, an active voice sentence, and the man was bitten by the dog, a passive voice sentence. It is well known that the passive voice is overused by academics. On the basis of the analysis which was made of the data which were collected, it is suggested that the null hypothesis can be rejected. And by lawyers, if the outstanding balance is prepaid in full, the unearned finance charge will be refunded. And most infamously of all by politicians, last week, Jeb Bush, when questioned about his brother's initiation of the invasion of Iraq, said, mistakes were made. The infamous evasive passive. And not surprisingly, all of the traditional manuals steer writers away from the passive voice. Strunk and White, for example, wrote, use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Many a tame sentence can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some such perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Now, did you know something a little fishy about that sentence? Yes, it uses the passive voice to tell writers not to use the passive voice. Now, the other ubiquitous bit of writing advice handed out to every college freshman is George Orwell's classic essay, Politics and the English Language, in which Orwell too writes, "A mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose." He wrote, by the way, in 1949, showing that some things don't change. I list below various of the tricks by means of which the work of prose construction is habitually dodged. The passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, an advisory that has not one, but two uses of the passive to tell writers not to use the passive. So what's going on? Well, the passive could not have survived in the English language for more than 1,500 years if it did not serve some purpose. Why can't we do without it? It boils down to the very design of language. You can think of language as an app for converting a web of thoughts into a string of words. So the writer's knowledge, as anyone who is familiar with cognitive psychology knows, can be modeled as a semantic network, a kind of mind-wide web. Here is a semantic network that represents a fragment of a person's knowledge of the tragic events brought to life in Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex. There are a number of concepts like Sophocles, kill, Oedipus, Laius, marry, song, Freud, and so on. There are a number of links from one concept to another, doer, done to, is, looks like, about, and so on. And when your mind simply ponders the story of Oedipus Rex, you can surf from any concept to any other concept in any direction. But when it comes time to packaging some portion of your knowledge so that you can communicate it to another person, you have to code it into a sentence, and a sentence is a linear string of words. In Sophocles' play, Oedipus married his mother and killed his father. Well, that creates an inherent problem that is just baked into the design of language, namely that the order of words in a sentence has to do two things at once. On the one hand, it's our code for meaning. It signals who did what to whom. The dog bit the man is different from the man bit the dog. At the same time, it necessarily presents some bits of information to the reader before others, and therefore it affects, the linear order of words affects how the information is absorbed. In particular, the early material in the sentence, the first words, naturally connect back to the context, to the topic, what the passage is about. In the metaphor of classic prose, what the reader is looking at. The end of the sentence is the sentence's focal point. It refers to what the reader should now notice. And any prose that violates these principles will feel choppy or disjointed or incoherent. And that brings us to the passive voice. The passive is a workaround for this design flaw in language. Namely, it allows writers to convey the same ideas, namely who did what to whom, while varying the order of words, namely what comes first. In particular, the passive allows the writer to start a sentence with the done to or acted upon rather than the doer or the actor. And that's why avoid the passive, offered as an across-the-board advisory, is bad advice. The passive is the better construction when the done to or the acted upon is currently the target of the reader's mental gaze. Again, let me be concrete. Here's a passage that I cut and pasted from the Wikipedia entry for Oedipus Rex. And spoiler alert, this is the part where it describes how the tragic backstory is revealed to the audience. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time he was given a baby. The baby, he says, was given to him by another shepherd from the Laius household who had been told to get rid of the child. Now notice that this passage has 3 passive voice sentences in a row, and for good reason. As the passage opens, all eyes are on the messenger. A messenger arrives from Corinth. The next sentence is, he was given a baby. The sentence begins with the actor upon whom our attention is focused. Well, now we are mentally looking at the baby, and the next sentence ought to begin with reference to the baby, and thanks to the passive voice, it does too. The baby was given to the messenger by another shepherd. Well, now all eyes are on the second shepherd, and the next sentence ought to begin with him, and again, thanks to the passive voice, it does. The other shepherd had been told to get rid of the child. Now, imagine that the writer of this passage followed the advice in the traditional style manuals and converted all the passives to the active voice, and there are many copy editors who will do exactly that. Here's how it will read. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time someone gave him a baby. Another shepherd from the Laius household, he says, whom someone had told to get rid of a child, gave the baby to him. Now, I think you'll agree that this is not an improvement. Our mental spotlight is whipsawed from one actor to another. Characters kind of parachute in out of the blue, all of which can be avoided by the judicious voice of the passive. More generally, English syntax provides writers with constructions that vary the left to right order in the string while preserving meaning. Oedipus killed Laius. Laius was killed by Oedipus. It was Laius whom Oedipus killed. It was Oedipus who killed Laius. And writers must choose the construction that introduces ideas to the reader in the order in which she can best absorb them. Well, that brings us back to the original question, why is the passive so common in bad writing? The reason is that good writers narrate a story advanced by protagonists who make things happen. Bad writers work backwards from their own knowledge, writing down ideas in the order in which they occur to them. They begin with the outcome of an event, because they know how the story turned out, and then they kind of throw in the cause as an afterthought, and the passive makes that all too easy. Well, that brings me to part 3. Why should this be so hard? Why is it so hard for writers to use the resources of language to convey ideas effectively? The best explanation that I know of is a psychological phenomenon that goes by many names, but my favorite comes from an economist who dubbed it the curse of knowledge. The fact that when you know something, it's hard to imagine what it is like for someone else not to know it. Similar phenomena have also been called mind blindness, failure of a theory of mind, egocentrism, hindsight bias. There are a number of other names. And perhaps the paradigm case is a classic experiment familiar to anyone who's taken a course in cognitive development that I'll call the M&M study. So a 3-year-old child comes into a lab, sits down at a little table. The experimenter hands him a M&M's box. He opens the box and is surprised to find that instead of containing M&M's, it has pencils in it. So the experimenter puts the pencils back in the box, closes it up, puts it back on the table, and now tells the boy, well, now another little boy is going to come in. Jason, what does Jason think is in the box? And the child will say, pencils. And you say, well, what did you think was in the box when you came into the room? And the child will say, pencils. That is, even though neither the child on starting the experiment nor the new child has any way to know that the box was tampered in, once the child knows it, he can no longer reconstruct the state of innocence or ignorance before he knew it. Now, of course, older children and we adults outgrow this infirmity, kinda, a little bit, sorta, because many studies have shown that adults are liable to a similar curse. We're apt to attribute our own vocabulary to others. If we know a word, we assume everyone else does. If we know an obscure fact, we tend to assume that it's common knowledge. And particularly when it comes to technical skills, we're cursed by our own expertise. One study found that the more practice someone had using a new gadget, the less time they estimated it would take a novice to learn it, because as it became more familiar to them, they just assumed that it was intrinsically easy to master. I think the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing. It simply doesn't occur to the writer that readers haven't learned their jargon, don't know the intermediate steps that seem to them to be too obvious to mention, can't visualize a scene that's currently in the writer's mind's eye. And so the writer doesn't bother to explain the jargon or spell out the logic or supply the concrete details, even when writing for professional peers. Now, there's a lazy excuse for bad writing that says, well, I'm writing for people just like me. It would be insulting, and I would come across as naive if I had to explain all the technical terms. The problem is that because of the curse of knowledge, we are all prone to overestimating how familiar our audience is with our own material. Again, I'll give you an example. This comes from an article on consciousness in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, a journal that is explicitly designed to keep scientists abreast of developments in their own field by people in other subfields. And the passage goes, "The slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising several hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus." Now, I read this and I had no idea what it was saying. For one thing, I have been in this business for many decades, and I'd never heard of the rabbit illusion. Have any of you heard of the rabbit illusion in this room? Not the duck rabbit illusion. So even those hands have to come down. The in what? It's related to well, maybe it is a cutaneous rabbit illusion is what I eventually found when going to my bookshelves, and it works as follows. You can see there's a demonstration of it on YouTube. So the subject closes his eyes, sticks out his arm. The experimenter taps him 3 times on the wrist, 3 times on the elbow, 3 times on the shoulder, and it feels like a continuous series of taps running up the length of your arm, kind of like a hopping rabbit, hence the rabbit illusion. Well, why didn't they just say that? It is, and likewise, I know what the word stimulus means, but I have no idea what stimulus referred to in this passage, and it's no more scientific to call something a stimulus than to call it a tap on the wrist, or to call something a post-stimulus event than to call it a tap on the elbow. In fact, not only is it not more scientific to talk in this way, it's much less scientific, because when you know concretely what the experiment consisted in, you could follow the logic. In this case, the idea is that since the later taps, position of the later taps influenced where you experienced the earlier taps, it means that consciousness does not track events in real time, but the brain is constantly editing experience after the fact to make your experience more coherent. Well, being able to visualize the experiment and follow the logic, you're now in a position to evaluate it, to see whether there might be some other explanation for the rabbit illusion, something that you cannot do when it's described in abstract language like stimulus and post-stimulus event. But my favorite illustration of the hazards of needless abbreviation come from an old joke, which I'm sure many of you have heard. So a man walks into the dining room of a Catskills resort, and he sees a bunch of retired Borscht Belt comedians sitting around a table, and so he joins them. And he sits down. One of them says, 47, and the others burst out into uproarious laughter. Then another one says, 62, and again, just gales of laughter and hilarity and mirth all around, and he can't figure out what's going on. So he says to the guy next to him, "What's happening here? What's going on?" And the guy says, "Well, these old timers, they've been around each other for so long that they all know the same jokes. So to save time, they've given each one a number. And now they just have to call out the number." The guy says, "That's ingenious. Let me try it." And so he says, 91. Stony silence. Try it. 27. Everyone stares at him. No one laughs. And so he kind of sinks down into his chair and he asks the guy next to him, "What happened? What did I do wrong?" He said, "It's all in the way you tell it." So how do we exercise the curse of knowledge? Well, the traditional answer is to empathize more, to keep in mind the reader over your shoulder, to see the world from their point of view, to walk a mile in their moccasins, to feel their pain, and so on. And that's good advice as far as it goes, but it really doesn't go far enough, because many studies in social psychology have shown that we're not very good at figuring out what other people are thinking, even when we try really, really hard. And Nick Epley's book, Mindwise, presents that case quite compellingly. Better is to actually show a draft to a representative reader, and you'll often be surprised to find that what's obvious to you is not obvious to anyone else. Or you can show a draft to yourself after enough time has passed that it's no longer familiar. And if you're like me, you'll find yourself thinking, that doesn't follow, or what did I mean by that? And all too often, who wrote this crap? And then rewrite several times with a single goal. No longer try to add content, but simply try to make the prose more and more understandable to the reader. Finally, how should we think about correct usage, the aspect of language that by far attracts the most attention and most emotion? So some usages are clearly wrong. When Cookie Monster says, "Me want cookie," even a preschool child knows that Cookie Monster has made a grammatical error, and that's why Cookie Monster is a humorous character. Similarly, the humor, such as it is in lolcats, such as "ICANN has cheeseburger," comes from our feeling of superiority over cats who have not mastered the ins and outs of English grammar. Is our children learning? Even former President George W. Bush acknowledged that this was a grammatical error in a self-deprecating speech in which he poked fun at his own infirmity with the language. But other usages are not so clear. And again, just to keep things politically nonpartisan, Bill Clinton came under fire when he first ran for president and had as one of his campaign slogans, "Give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back." The infamous "between you and I" error. The English teacher said it should be "give Al Gore and me a chance." Another Democratic president, Barack Obama, said in a speech, "No American should ever live under a cloud of suspicion just because of what they look like." The singular they error. Captain James T. Kirk, "To boldly go where no man has gone before." Split infinitive. For you youngsters out there, the Beatles. "You think you lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday, eh? It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say, eh?" Preposition at the end of a sentence. And then some of you may remember the suave, urbane, articulate talk show host Dick Cavett. Well, in a recent op-ed reminiscing about a college reunion, he wrote, "Checking into the hotel, it was nice to see a few of my old classmates in the lobby." Anyone spot the alleged grammatical error in that sentence? Dangling modifier, yes. Some of you are over the age of 60 or have taken grammar lessons. Well, these cases have led to what journalists sometimes call the language war, which pits on one side the prescriptivists, those who prescribe how people ought to speak and write, also known as the purists, sticklers, pedants, peevers, snobs, snoots, nitpickers, traditionalists, language police, usage nannies, grammar Nazis, and the gotcha gang, according to whom rules of usage are objectively correct. To obey them is to uphold standards of excellence. To flout them is to dumb down literate culture, degrade the language, and hasten the decline of civilization. On the other side, we have the descriptivists, those who describe how people do speak and write, according to whom rules of usage are just the secret handshake of the ruling class. The people should be liberated to write however they please. And you will see this dichotomy played out in article after article in the press. I think there's reason to believe, though, that the language war is a pseudo-controversy. If it were true, then prescriptivists would have to insist that the Beatles should have sung "It's You of Whom She's Thinking." And descriptivists would insist there is nothing wrong with "ICANN has cheeseburger." I think we need a more sophisticated way of thinking about usage. So what are rules of usage? They're obviously not logical truths that you could prove like mathematical theorems, nor are they officially regulated by dictionaries the way the rules of baseball are regulated by the Rules Committee of Major League Baseball. And I can speak with some authority here because I'm the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary. And when I signed on, the first question that I asked the editor is, "So how do you guys decide what goes into a dictionary?" And he said, "We pay attention to the way people use words." In other words, when it comes to what's correct and incorrect, there's no one in charge. The lunatics are running the asylum. So how do we make sense of this paradox? Well, it's to think of rules as tacit evolving conventions. Now, a convention is a way of doing things that has no merit other than the fact that everyone else is doing it. Some obvious examples are paper currency. There's nothing inherently valuable in a green piece of paper with a president's face on it, other than the fact that everyone else treats it as valuable. Or driving on the right as opposed to the left. Neither one is superior as long as everyone has agreed on the same choice. As in an old joke about a man who's driving to work and gets a call on his cell phone from his wife, she says, "Be very careful, honey. I've been listening to the radio and they say that there's a maniac out there driving on the wrong side of the freeway." And he says, "One maniac? There are hundreds of them." But unlike traffic laws and paper currency, the conventions behind grammar are tacit. They emerge as a rough consensus within a community of careful writers without explicit deliberation, agreement, or legislation. And they're evolving. The conventions may change, and in fact always do change over time, as we saw with the acceptance of the formerly novel words to finalize and to contact. So should writers follow the rules? And the answer is it depends. Some rules just extend the logic of everyday grammar to more complicated cases. For example, why is the sentence, "Is our children learning?" ungrammatical? Even George Bush agreed that it was, and so does the Microsoft Word grammar checker, which flags it with the infamous green wiggly line. Well, the answer is that "is our children learning" is equivalent to "our children is learning," and everyone agrees that "our children is learning" is not a legitimate English sentence. Or a slightly more complex case that's been studied by psycholinguists such as Kay Bach, the impact of the cuts have not been felt yet. Now again, if you type that, your copy of Microsoft Word will flag it with a green wiggly line. And it takes a little while to figure out what's wrong with it, namely that the subject of the sentence is impact, not cuts. If you get rid of the cuts, you get the impact have not been felt yet, which jumps off the page as a grammatical error. It grates on everyone's ears, and that's why the impact of the cuts have not been felt yet is also ungrammatical. Also, some word choices make important semantic distinctions. If you thank someone for their fulsome praise, you have not done credit either to yourself or to the person that you think you are complimenting, because fulsome is not a fancy schmancy synonym for full. It means excessive or insincere or oleaginous or falsely flattering. Likewise, I advise you not to compliment a colleague's elegant theory by calling it simplistic as opposed to simple. They do not mean the same thing. Nor should you praise something that you think is meritorious by calling it meretricious. And if you don't know why, go home and look it up. If you try to use a hoity-toity word that you think is a highfalutin synonym of a plainer word, you're apt to elicit the reaction that Inigo Montoya did in The Princess Bride when Vizzini kept using the word inconceivable to refer to things that just happened. Namely, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. On the other hand, not every pet peeve, bit of grammatical folklore, or dimly remembered lesson from Miss Thistlebottom's classroom is a legitimate rule of usage. And scholars who've tracked these rules down have found that many of them violate the grammatical logic of English, are routinely flouted by today's best writers, and have always been flouted by the best writers. An example being the singular they that for which President Obama got into trouble. One writer claimed in the writing for the Weekly Standard, argued that singular they is a mangling of the language foisted upon us by radical feminists in search of gender-neutral language, and that we should reject such linguistic engineering and go back to the crystalline prose of Jane Austen. Whoops. Turns out that Jane Austen herself used singular they 87 times in her novels, as in everybody began to have their vexation. Likewise, if you object to a preposition at the end of a sentence, maybe you should go back and correct Shakespeare when he said, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." The same is true of split infinitives, dangling participles between you and I. It turns out there is nothing behind the prohibition of those constructions. In fact, obeying bogus rules is not just a waste of time, but it can make prose worse. This comes from a communication from the Harvard Press Office that I received in my inbox. David Rockefeller has pledged $100 million to increase dramatically learning opportunities for Harvard undergraduates. Now, this writer has bent himself into such a pretzel to avoid a split infinitive that he has ended up with a sentence that is really not a part of the English language. In fact, obeying bogus rules can literally precipitate a crisis in governance. Literally. In January 2009, President-elect Barack Obama was sworn in by Chief Justice John Roberts, who is a notorious stickler for grammar. And what Roberts was supposed to have had Obama say was, "I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States." But Roberts could not abide the split verb in the wording mandated by the Constitution, and so he abandoned his strict constructionism, unilaterally rewrote the Constitution and had Obama say, "I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will execute the office of President of the United States faithfully," which again not only is not a stylistic improvement over the wording stipulated by the framers, but it could have called into question the legitimacy of the transition of power. If you thought the so-called birthers are bad now, just imagine if Obama had never been sworn in according to the wording in the Constitution. And so they had to repeat the ceremony in a private meeting in the Oval Office later that afternoon. So how should a careful writer distinguish the legitimate rules of usage from the bogus ones? The answer is unbelievably simple. Look them up. Turns out that all of the modern dictionaries and style guides do not ratify the pet peeves and bogus rules. If you look up split infinitive in Merriam-Webster's, it says it's all right to split an infinitive in the interest of clarity. Since clarity is the usual reason for splitting, this advice means merely that you can split them whenever you need to. In Cardo Dictionary, there is no grammatical basis for rejecting split infinitives. American Heritage, same thing. Random House Dictionary, same thing. Modern dictionaries and style manuals do not ratify grammatical folklore because they base their advice on evidence, on practices of contemporary good writers, on the practices of the best writers in the past, and on polling data from a panel of writers for contested cases where at the American Heritage Dictionary we try to settle this empirically. We have assembled a panel of 200 respected writers. Simply ask them, would you ever use the following word in this sense? Would you use this construction in your own prose? And report in the dictionary the actual data on what today's best writers do. Also on effects on clarity and consistency with the grammatical logic of English as worked out by contemporary linguists. But also, correct usage should be kept in perspective, though it is certainly worth respecting the legitimate rules of English usage. They are the least important part of good writing. They pale in importance compared to maintaining classic style, coherent ordering of ideas, overcoming the curse of knowledge, to say nothing of factual diligence and sound argumentation. And for that matter, even the most irksome errors are not signs of the decline of language, a point made in a lovely cartoon by Randall Munroe, the author of XKCD, in which he shows a grammatical purist being visited by a ghost in the middle of the night. And the ghost says, "I bring a cautionary vision of things to come. This is the future. And this is the future if you give up the fight over the word literally." And yes, they're exactly the same. So to sum up, I believe that modern linguistics and cognitive science and social psychology, for that matter, provide better ways of enhancing our writing. Firstly, a model of prose communication, namely classic style, in which language is seen as a window onto the world. an understanding of the way language works, in particular the way that it maps a web of thoughts onto a string of words, a diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, namely the curse of knowledge, and a way to make sense of rules of correct usage, namely as tacit evolving conventions. Thank you very much.